Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Lotus MDF White Honey Processed Colombia from Mood Trap Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Mood Trap, based out of Singapore, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel multiple times before, including most recently when we reviewed their Gesha Passiflora. And this coffee was actually released at the same time as that one, so I figured we would add it onto our order, even though this one doesn't necessarily sound like my type of coffee. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 84. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. With this one though, I had to go a couple notches more fine on the grind itself. So that's to say, definitely go a little bit more fine than you typically would for your V60 if you're opting for that brew method. Now, roast profile for this one, as we've mentioned in our previous Mood Trap videos, they definitely still roast on the lighter side of most metrics, as this one is still a very light coffee by almost all standards and metrics. So that's to basically say that this is just about as light as you can get for a coffee. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this one. Day 60, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and it offered a mostly clean base with an ever so slight fermentiness that does dissipate as the cup cools down. So there's that trademark slightly bitter floral aspect that is in line with a lot of listed coffee cherry notes that I find, as it is the most prominent and pronounced profile in the cup, with a hidden dark candy sweetness also present that's in the finish reminiscent of what I would describe as dark chocolate. So not necessarily my profile to begin with, but I was curious to see what else we would get from this one. Day 62 opted for the Chemex, and it continues to remain mostly clean with a lingering fermentiness underneath. Still, there is a slight bit of that floral bitterness, as the most pronounced component in this cup is the complementary chocolate, so a very similar experience from the first two times brewing this coffee. We continue on to day 65, opted for the April brewer, and this offered the most amount of clarity that I'd experienced up to this point, as there wasn't as much of an indication of fermenty aspects to it, but it could have even been mistaken for a wash processed coffee, as the result lent towards more sweetness and a softer floral expression to the cup, with a slight bit of the bitterness in that floral sense once again. So much better all around, as it's focusing a little bit more on the softer attributes of the florality. Day 68, higher temperatures and a more fine grind, and I found a little bit of an improvement with this adjustment, as there was a bit less of the bitterness through the cup, and it continued to remain on the more bitter floral side of things, with a little bit more of that dark chocolate attribute present within the cup. A slightly unripened citrus, but a better amount of definition to what I would describe as a high percentage cacao chocolate. Day 71, same adjustments to the Chemex, and the cup has been quite consistent, as there's a notable dark chocolate base with some really nice clarity. So I've actually seen an increase in clarity from the cup, as it's not necessarily offering those same sort of earlier fermenty aspects to it. Darker berry is much more present, as the floral bitterness does feel a little bit more toned down in this cup. Day 73, back to the standard recipe, and I honestly couldn't tell if the cup was just tapering off a bit, as I've been struggling with it up to this point. It is a little bit more tame and moderate relative to some of the earlier experiences, as the majority of the cup does come through in the finish with a more clean florality, and the chocolate being a little bit more clean and defined. Little to no fermentiness, so that's been a very notable shift, as earlier on I was saying there's this fermenty aspect, and I was kind of working to adjust that, to lower that, to reduce that, but it honestly felt like this cup just seemed to do that on its own naturally through time. Day 77 went even more fine on the grind, and this is when I finally felt like I might have gotten this coffee correct, as it yielded plenty of success with the most amount of sweetness I'd experienced up to this point. I don't necessarily think this coffee was ever meant to be an overly sweet coffee, but I just couldn't help but shake the feeling that I was struggling to get the type of sweetness that was possible within it, as it has been continuously toning down some of those fermenty aspects to it. Still plenty of dark chocolate, but at this time in a much sweeter sense, and that really seems to help with this one overall. Day 80, final notes we have one more try with the same adjustments, and it felt like it finally reached a point of consistency as it was offering much more of the hidden sweetness on the cool down with little to no fermentiness. A pretty herbal floral cup dominated by a darker chocolate is kind of the best way I could describe it, at least towards the end. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those real quick, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. I feel like that's a really nice accomplishment and success for this coffee, given that it is a white honey processed Colombian coffee. By all expectations, I fully expected this one to have maybe a little bit more fermentiness than it did. And right at the onset, I said, okay, I'm going to be in trouble with this one because the fermentiness is present and it's kind of influencing and impacting this cup. But towards the end, given that I was able to reduce that to a point where it was almost non-present, level 4 is a really nice victory for this coffee in that sense. Finish, level 4. So that's that dark chocolate finish that's present within it. I think that they have something like a cacao listed as one of the notes, maybe cacao nibs, but it would make a lot of sense. That was the most defined and strongest characteristic, but also the most pronounced thing within the finish itself. So not too overbearing in any regard, and I'm always grateful when there is any sort of fermented coffee that doesn't have an even further and long-lasting finish to it. White honey is pretty safe in general, but even then it's always a little bit of a concern. Florality, level 4. That's the other thing I've been mentioning throughout, is that this one had a little bit of that bitter floral component to it right from the start. Towards the end, it was a little bit more of a softer floral and an even more herbal floral expression to this cup, but it was one of the ever-present aspects to it, so level 4 felt fitting for it. Chocolate, level 4. That's the other thing, and it's one of the first things I mentioned, and it was probably the most consistent characteristic throughout, as it had a very well-defined dark chocolate aspect to it. And so when I was able to get this coffee at its best, it was a little bit more sweet in that sense too, as dark chocolate doesn't necessarily tend to be an overly sweet chocolate to begin with, but given that I was able to experience that in a little bit more, we'll just say sweeter of a manner, that was much better. And I feel like towards the end, I got a pretty good idea of what this coffee was at least meant to be. And then we have quite a few level 3s. We will start with the sweetness level 3. I played back and forth on the sweetness, and when I originally made this tasting wheel, I put it at a level 4, but I said to myself, this one is nowhere near as sweet as any of the other coffees that we've had from Mood Trap up to this point, so I feel like keeping it down at a 3 is probably best, because that will indicate that it wasn't quite as sweet as the Passiflora or the Myrna Zamora, which was one of the sweetest coffees we've ever reviewed, or the Gesha Village. So let's keep this at a 3 for now. Same thing with the acidity. I said this one, interestingly, isn't quite as bright as some of those other ones either, so I want to keep this one toned down to the level 3, as at no point was I really mentioning the brightness, because it didn't really seem to play as big of a role in this cup as maybe I might have expected. Nonetheless, not necessarily the most overly pronounced characteristic to it. Citrus fruit and berry fruit both reached that level 3 mark, and once again, I think that they have a coffee cherry list on here, but in addition to that, I was able to get a little bit more of that ever so slight Colombian, we'll say non-washed berry component that's present within those. It is that ever so slight fermentiness that you can experience from Colombian coffees, but it was a little bit more clean, so we're just kind of thinking a little bit more of a red berry, ever so slight. Citrus fruit, also present. As I kind of mentioned, it was, I would say, a little bit more undefined of a citric aspect to it, but it was present enough to justify and chart there at that level 3 mark. Savoriness, level 3, and that's a couple of things. That's the dark chocolate savoriness, but in addition to that, there's an ever so slight savory, bitter, herbal aspect that's present within this one. I kind of lumped it in and attributed it to the floral components within it, but the ever so slight savory aspect did score at that level 3, which is to say, given that this cup wasn't necessarily the most flavorful or just strong coffee to begin with, those things scoring at that level 3 don't necessarily indicate that they were very strong within the cup. It's just that the cup really seemed to skew very heavily in one direction and then offered some other things to kind of go around that. Body level 2, that part might be a little interesting given what this coffee is, the origin, as well as the processing method and the brewer that we opted for. It was a little bit more lighter bodied than I might have expected, only scoring in the level 2. I do know that I was between a 2 and a 3, but once again, I said this cup doesn't really seem to have as much texture and body as I might have expected from some other cups that do score at that level 3 mark. So a lot of the things on this tasting wheel are in that in-between stage, but as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think that it's a pretty good representation actually of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one is my least favorite of the Mood Trap coffees that we've had up to this point, and I feel like I was really struggling with it for a bit up to a certain point. And I feel like once I got to that point, I said, I don't think this coffee is ever actually meant to be my type of coffee, and I kind of knew that when I first purchased it, but given that I had had universally positive experiences with both of the coffees that I'd had from Mood Trap earlier, I felt Mood Trap could do no wrong, and even a coffee that may not have necessarily sounded like my type of coffee might have far exceeded my expectations, but it didn't. And that just goes to show that even some of the coffee roasters that you very much enjoy, because I think Mood Trap's amazing, they're not always going to serve you your favorite coffee, and that's the case with this one, as I found it to be just fine. It's just not my type of coffee, and that kind of transitions into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. And the first direction I want to point somebody towards is somebody that does like their very strong, darker chocolate aspects, because this one right here had it in a lighter profiled coffee, and it really seemed to skew and be well defined in that specific sense, while offering some kind of contrasting and additional complexity to it. That, of course, being the interesting floral components that were present within it, the slight herbal aspects that were present within it, even a slight bit of spice and some fruit components to contrast all of those things. Really nice sweetness. If you can get the sweetness at a certain point, then I felt like that was complementary to the rest of the coffee. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Lotus MDF White Honey Processed Colombia from Mood Trap Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.